The concept of my Who Is series has always been to introduce modern esports fans to people who typically are legends within esports, people like old CS players, old StarCraft players, older League of Legends players at some point in time, actually I'll do. But in this particular incident, a circumstance that's happened where Rick Fox, a former NBA pro, has bought an LCS team means I actually have an opportunity to introduce you to a sports player, traditional sports player. And if you know anything about me outside of the esports world, which admittedly not many people will, basketball is my favorite sport. I like it when they dribble up and down the court. Most of you won't even know what that means. But when I used to be an esports journalist earlier in my career, for say the first 7 or 8 years, I used to have a lot of time on my hands because I didn't have enough money to go out and do stuff because I didn't have much money at the time. I used to be sat there with a lot of time off when I wasn't doing my esports journalism because I was at the computer all day. I was working from home. And in this time off, with an internet connection at all times, I would download lots of games. I would watch lots of old basketball games. And a team particularly that I did watch from the 2000s was the Lakers. And I really paid a lot of attention to them. Saw probably all the big games, all the series certainly. And so actually this is a player I'm quite familiar with. So here's a chance to kind of give some of you League of Legends fans an insight into who Rick Fox was as a player. So you can now get a chance to understand that context coming into his phase as an owner. So he's someone who, in terms of outside of esports, he had previously tweeted about League of Legends. I know he tweeted at Afromoo, and he'd said stuff about LCS, and it sounds like maybe he started watching it and got interested with his son. I know he actually attended the Madison Square Garden final of LCS Summer, last split, where the one where CLG beat TSM in a sweep in the final. He attended that, and he did a quick interview there with his son. And when he's done NBA TV work, where they over Skype, they'll do an interview with a player who played in the game. They actually interviewed at one point in time Gordon Hayward, who's someone else who's a pro basketball player who's showed an interest in esports. And actually, at the end of the interview, he raised with him the question of what did he think of Doublelift going from CLG to TSM, because that was actually quite fresh news. And obviously, it's quite a shocking question to ask someone on a traditional sports interview. So it made the front page of Reddit for League of Legends, etc. So obviously we know he has some passing interest in League of Legends specifically, and esports is a more general phenomenon. Now, Rick Fox as a player, or Foxy as he was labelled by and nicknamed by the legendary Chick Hearn, the now passed away sadly commentator for the LA Lakers, the play-by-play commentator. He's a guy he grew up in the Bahamas, and he technically is Canadian. I think he was born in Canada, but he grew up in the Bahamas. That's where his dad's from. And he was even playing basketball there originally. Then he's in America for the college system there. He ends up being able to go to North Carolina, quite a famous, legendary basketball program there. So he plays for the Tar Heels there, who probably the most famous alumni there is Michael Jordan, obviously. He actually won the championship with them in the early 80s. And when he plays for this team, they managed to, in 1990, they actually managed to upset Oklahoma, who were the number 1 seed at the time. And in that game, Rick Fox actually made the last shot of the game, like a last-second shot. It was a driving layup. So they got an upset there. The year following that, 1991, they made the Final Four of the NCAA. And they lost there to the Kansas Jayhawks. And unfortunately, in that game, Rick Fox had a really poor game. He went 5 for 22 from the floor and was a guy who he let his team down in that particular game. Maybe if he'd done better, they would have won the game. So it was a quite close loss, actually. And the thing is, in college, he was the star player. Now, what's interesting is, in this college system, he got to play under Dean Smith, who was a truly legendary North American basketball college coach, because as a head coach of the North Carolina Tar Heels, he finished his career with a 77% win rate. He won the NCAA twice. He made the Final Four 11 times. Now, as a player, not only was Rick Fox the star player of this particular unit, but he was a three-point shooter. He had good percentage there. He had pretty much a pretty good all-around game at the time. Now, he gets drafted by the Boston Celtics, who are literally one of the most storied franchises in history, because they'd won tons of championships. In fact, just 6 seasons prior to him getting drafted, they'd won the championship in 1986 with the unit that was Larry Bird. And when he joins, his first season is the last season combined of the big three, where they have Larry Bird, they have Kevin McHale, and they have Robert Parrish. The big three players, the amazing front court that won all those championships for the Celtics. And so coming into a team like that, understandably, he's not going to get to start. So he gets drafted in the first round. He goes as the 24th pick overall. But he doesn't get to start. He only starts 5 of the 81 games that he plays in. He's only a 22-year-old guy at the time. He only averages 8 points. At the time, even though they had the big three there, actually the best player and the player who's emerging as the star of the team at this point, because Larry Bird's really broken down with his back, and it's actually his last season, was actually Reggie Lewis, a guy who was a really skilled player, and if he hadn't have tragically died the next year, possibly would have gone on to be like a perennial all-star, and was actually developing into like a legit, maybe even superstar player one day. We hadn't quite seen that. I mean, he was still in his prime when he died, unfortunately. And Reggie Lewis died the following year, around just before the preseason. Actually, no, it was in towards the end of the summer. It was in like July sometime in summer. So there was one really good game in the first season for Rick Fox, which is he had a 31-point game where he scored 13 baskets out of 23 attempts. And so he had one big game that kind of showed off he's got some potential here, but he had to wait his turn. There were still better players, still more tenured players, still veterans who were ahead of him in the rotation. So Reggie Lewis dying, unfortunately, meant that the Celtics were really set back as a team because they'd lost Bird, he'd retired. Reggie Lewis, their best players, now passed away, unfortunately. Some of the other players are getting really old and are very much ready to retire or move on to other teams for a last shot at some greatness. So at this point in time, Rick Fox is potentially at least now going to get a chance to start. So in 94, he starts 53 games, and unfortunately the team doesn't make the playoffs though. In 1995, this time he only gets to start 7 games. He gets pushed back in the rotation again because they bring in Dominique Williams, who was an all-time great small forward who played with the Atlanta Hawks and been a truly great player, Hall of Fame player. They had Xavier McDaniel, very physical player, defensive player. So he had to kind of sit back and wait his turn there. He was only playing 90 minutes a game. But after that, he gets to come forwards and emerge as one of the best players in the team, if not the best player in admittedly what's not a good team. They're not ever a playoff team after 95. And from 96 to 97, he starts to become the star player of the team. Like in 97, his best season, he's aged 28. Start entering your physical prime as an athlete. He averages 15 points, 5 rebounds, 3 assists, 1 steal. So you can see he's got a complete game here. He's maybe getting to the point where if he stays in that sort of a system, it's not going to be a good team, but if his team gets a bit better, maybe one day he could have been an all-star. That's just a maybe though. There's still a lot of talented players in the league. I think it was more like he was just a good player and he would have been a good second or third option if the right players had been available. Now after that though, he hasn't played in the playoffs for a while. He gets the opportunity to sign with the Lakers. And the Lakers, when he signs with them in 98, already are an incredibly deep and talented team who've already been making playoffs and doing good performances there. And they've got Shaquille O'Neal, one of the best players in the entire league, very dominant center. Kobe's coming to the league, being drafted, highly touted prospect who's starting to develop at this point in time. They have great other starters, actually. Nick Van Exel, a guy who can shoot the long ball, like a really good outside shooter. Often used to take the last second shot in the games then. They had Eddie Jones, who's a really good slashing shooting guard, who had a decent mid-range shot. Also quite a highlight dunker at the time, explosive player. And then they had Eldon Campbell, who was the backup center because Shaquille came along, but he himself could have been a starting center elsewhere in the league. They had a lot of talent. So coming to this lineup, he has to know coming in, I'm not going to be a star like I was in Boston. I'm not going to have a chance to even be like a main contributing guy to the offense. I'm going to be a role player, and I'm going to have to play, and I'm going to have to carve out a niche for myself. And so the role he was going to carve out for himself was as a defensive player, as to lock people down and to be an enforcer and to be kind of the edge, the dirtier side of the game, to keep the opponent honest, to keep them knocked off their game every now and then, to keep them having to play physically as well as just playing with the smarts that you can in basketball. So he comes into the Lakers and he gets to be a starter for his first season in 98, where they make it all the way to the Western Conference Final, but unfortunately they get swept there by Malone and Stockton's Jazz, who went on to the finals, even though in this particular series, Shaquille O'Neal was playing like a beast, but the rest of the team just wasn't there for him. And the Jazz were a veteran team that really had a good system around themselves, and obviously a veteran coach in Jerry Sloan, a great coach. He did have one really good game in that playoff run, which was in the first round against the Portland Trail Blazers. In game 2, he had 24 points on 14 field goal attempts, so a good game there. The next year, 1999, unfortunately, he has to take a backup role and come off the bench because the Lakers trying to beef up the talent even more. They signed Glenn Rice, who was an all-star level small forward, so he has to come off the bench there. The team makes it to the second round of the playoffs this time, where they lose to the Spurs and get swept there. That was actually the lockout season, so it was a shortened season. Then for 2000, they get Phil Jackson as their coach, and he's a legendary coach. He's a guy where he was the coach of the Chicago Bulls in the 90s, where they won 6 championships with Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, 2 three-peats, 1991 to 93, and then 96 to 98. And in 2000, the Lakers managed to win the title. They have one period of like legit Resistance, which is the Western Conference Final against the Portland Trailblazers, another really deep team. In fact, they had Scottie Pippen on that team. And it goes all 7 games, but the Lakers prevail. They get to the finals, and they manage to beat the Indiana Pacers there, Reggie Miller's Indiana Pacers. They win the championship. Rick Fox has won a one championship. The next season, 2001, the team, because of Kobe's injury towards the end of the season, they have a period where they slump a little bit. But then they get it together. He comes back. They have this little streak to end the season. And then throughout the playoffs, they go on this mad streak. They win, let me think. Was it been like 11 games in a row until the final? So they swept the Trailblazers. They swept the Sacramento Kings. They swept the Spurs in the Western Conference Finals, who were an extremely good team, one of the best defensive teams in the league. And then in the final, they lost the first game to the Allen Iverson 76ers, but then they won the next 4 and they won the series. And actually, in the clinching game, Game 5, Fox had a 20-point game on only 8 shots. He made all his 3-pointers, all his free throws, helped close this game out rather than let it go to 6. And they go back-to-back. They repeat as champions. In 2002, they win the championship again. They do a three-peat, giving Phil Jackson his 3rd three-peat. And on this run, the key series is the Western Conference Finals again. And this is where they play the Sacramento Kings, a very deep team, a team that was really good at moving the ball, a team that had a very good skill parity across the lineup and score with this great offense they had. Very flashy team as well. And the series would go 7 games. The Lakers only even tied it up at 4 games at 2-2 with a crazy shot by Robert Horry. Then they were down 3-2 and they had to win the last 2. Game 6 was kind of a bit bullshit. The refs gave them a lot of fouls and free throws. That's the one a lot of people suspect was like fixed, because one of the refs later on came out and suggested that he had fixed games for money, because the Lakers got a lot of free throws to win that game. Game 7 though is a legit win, an overtime win, a gutsy win. So they win there. Now, in 2003, going for their 4th championship, the Lakers already have some problems. Shaq's injured early in the season. This is where Fox is starting to come off, like his productivity is dropping off a little bit. Unfortunately, in the playoffs, in the first round, and I think it was like the second to last game or something against the Timberwolves, Kevin Garnett's team, he actually has a foot injury. Was it a foot injury? It was some sort of injury, and he has to go out of the series and he doesn't play the rest of the playoffs. And they go to the next round of the playoffs and they play the Spurs there and they lose there actually. And being as they lost in 6 games and he didn't get to play and he was a starting player and they didn't have their coach for 2 of the games, I think actually ironically 2 of the games they won, Phil Jackson, because he had some sort of heart complications he had to go and get checked out. You always will wonder if he'd been able to play, if he hadn't been injured, could they have gone to 7 games? Could they have maybe won this series? Something you'll always wonder about, but we never got to find out. So he'd been a starter during all the championship runs, but in 2004, the team brought in Gary Payton, they brought in Karl Malone, they went for this all-star team, and this is where, okay, for 38 of the games, Fox started for 34 of them, but then he had to miss 40 games of the regular season with a foot injury. And in the playoffs, he only got to play in 3 of the games in the whole 16 they played, so they went all the way to the finals. And they actually lost in the NBA finals to the Pistons in 5 games, and that's when he decided to retire. His last game was losing to the Pistons, going for his 4th championship, being unable to win 4 championships in a 5-year span of being a championship contending team. Now, at that point in time, after that season, he was traded with Peyton and a draft pick actually to the Celtics, and he was immediately waived by the Celtics. He just retired. That was the end of his career. Over his NBA career, for his career, his stats were he averaged 9.6 points per game, 3.8 rebounds per game, 2.8 assists a game. So not a bad contributing like a role player score there. In the playoffs, his numbers dipped a bit, but then he did play with some superstar players whose numbers would rise in the playoffs. So over 56 NBA career playoff games, he averaged 6.1 points a game, 2.6 rebounds a game, and 1.8 assists a game. So not a big-time playoff performer in terms of scoring, etc., and putting the stuff in the stat sheet. In fact, he had a number of playoff games where he never even scored a point, or he only got a couple of shots, because within the offense, that wasn't going to be his role. And that's the thing about Rick Fox. For the majority of his career, after the Boston period, early on he was just a guy on the bench trying to get into the game. Players were before him in the rotation, better players than him, all-star level players. Then he gets in the game. The team's very bad, though. He becomes a star, though, at one point in time within the Boston franchise. But then he gives that up to come and buy into the concept of trying to win championships as a contributing role player. And so he's not a star for the majority of his career, playing with the Lakers. But for the Lakers, his primary thing is he was the three-point shooter. This is a guy where his best numbers were always going to be spot-up three-point shooter, move the ball in the triangle offense that Phil Jackson would run, wait until he's open, get him the ball, set your feet, wait, receive the ball, shoot the ball immediately in motion. He did a decent rate of that. He had decent shooting there. And He was a guy where either he's going to make the three-point shot, or if the lanes are open because people are paying attention to Kobe and Shaq and he gets a pass from them, he can cut and he can make a layup. He was pretty good in terms of layups. He would have pretty good accuracy there. He wouldn't tend to fumble layups. It's something he practiced a lot as a player, actually. But beyond his offensive game, which was fairly limited in the Lakers, he was a good defensive player. He wasn't a great defensive player, but he was a good defensive player because he had the hustle and he would use intelligence, and also he was the enforcer. And so he's a guy who would try and get up in your face and he would try and provoke you and throw a little elbow in your side every now and then, or maybe talk a bit of shit to you, maybe try and get you to fight him sometimes to take you out of your focus, to break you off your game, to see what you were made of, to see if you could handle that sort of physical play, which at the time was still tolerated in the NBA. Now, it's interesting because off the court, he's a really soft-spoken guy. This guy's really good with the ladies. He's a really funny guy. Seems like a loyal guy. But he jawed a lot on the court, and he really did play this enforcer role. And in fact, funnily enough, one of the teams that he went against a lot, two of the teams that they'd had troubles with in the playoffs, so Portland Trail Blazers, actually nicknamed the Jail Blazers because of some of the extracurricular activities they had going on there. He's a guy where he was talking mad shit to those guys, getting in the face of like Rasheed Wallace, who was a guy you could definitely trigger, talking shit to Steve Smith, who's a guy who liked to jaw a little bit, even talking shit to their coach, Mike Dunleavy, actually, back in the 2000 playoffs. He would get into it with those guys. And most famously, because they had this acrimonious relationship with the Kings, who they'd beaten all the time in the playoffs, especially in that 2002 series where the Kings, to some degree, should have probably won or could have won, and themselves thought they should have won and probably would have won the championship if they'd won. He always got into it with some of their players. Vadi Divac, Chris Webber's a guy who would get mad, he could trigger, and especially Doug Christie. In fact, actually, in the season after that, in the preseason for the 2003 season, there was a game against the Kings, and Rick Fox elbowed Doug Christie. Doug Christie fell over, so when Doug Christie got up, he tried to go in Rick Fox's face, so Rick Fox put his hand up like that, but he put it up in a way where he's just putting his arms up, but he purposely knocked the guy a little bit like that. So Doug Christie actually sucker punch uppercutted him on his jaw, and they both got thrown out the game. So you can see this is a guy who's going to mix it up when he's in the game. He's going to contribute that way as well. Try to fuck with opposing players, get them thrown out the game, get them on tilt, get them committing fouls. Because the key thing about being an NBA enforcer is they nearly always, the refs tended not to catch the first elbow. Because the guy who'd get elbowed, he'd be really annoyed and he'd do something really emphatic. That's what would get caught. It tended to be, if you were the agitator, it's the guy who responded, who tried to get his revenge, who tend to get blamed there. So actually you could play this role. And he wasn't doing it to a mad Dennis Rodman level, but he was doing it to a lesser degree. It was a way to also contribute and to make the team tough. Because obviously, beside that, there was some finesse in some of the plays, some three-point shooting. And so, yeah, interesting in that particular sense. He was a guy where the main positive about his career is that he was willing to be a role player. He was willing to buy into the team concept, to facilitate other superstar players, to play in the triangle system, trusting that the system would get him shots every now and then, the right ones, but that it'll also give him a chance to win championships, playing with great players, playing under a great coach like Phil Jackson. He really bought into this team concept. But because he played as a role player, and even when he'd become a good player at the Celtics, it was early on in his career, so he hadn't had a chance to get the big contract. He actually only made $34 million over his whole NBA career. Now, he had a career that was successful outside of just basketball, though. Even as a player, he was getting to start in movies and TV. He was in some of the early 90s basketball movies, most famously one of them, Blue Chips, which a number of people will have seen. He was in 1997, he actually got to start appearing in Oz, which was a really gritty kind of prison drama at the time. And I won't give a spoiler, but something actually, quite a horrible end happened to one of his characters, well, the character that he played in that particular show. Quite a famous show at the time. He was an actor in a movie that I actually saw because it's just a B movie, a movie called Resurrection, which was a Christopher Lambert project. And when I tell you it's a Christopher Lambert project, you should know it probably wasn't very good because he's mainly only famous for playing Raiden in Mortal Kombat, which is a bit of an iffy movie, and being the star of Highlander, where the first one's a wicked movie, but I think it came out in 1990 or 1989 or something. Was that actually when it came out? Did Highlander have actually come out? I can't remember. Anyway, but the other movies Crystal Lambert in were fairly terrible, so you know it wasn't a good movie in that particular sense. Beyond that, in the 2000s, he started a number of famous shows. He started in One Tree Hill. There was the remake of Melrose Place. He was in an episode of The Big Bang Theory. He was on Dancing with the Stars even. He's a guy who is a very amiable, very funny guy. He seems to get very smooth with the ladies. He seems to have a lot of personality, a lot of charisma to him. And obviously, what's interesting is because he understands his team dynamics and the team concept of how to be a role player. That's what I wonder if he could bring to League of Legends. I hope he hires good coaches and he had good general managers to buy the players and to run the team and doesn't interject in that way. But if it comes to giving speeches, locker room type speeches, or working with a player who's having confidence issues or who doesn't know how to be a contributing player without being the star player if he's been a good player, this is where he could help them. He's got experience here and he's played these sorts of roles and he understands mentally what's going on there. So that's who Rick Fox is as a player. Now then, if there was a draft, much like the NBA draft, for fantasy esports sites, I reckon Alpha Draft would got to be my number one pick in the draft. And, you know, they're just guys who they come in on fire, they're shooting deep from downtown, much like their deep tournament contests and wealth of games that they have. They have high prize pools to go with the high accuracy of a player from the field like Shaquille O'Neal, who played with Rick Fox. They're guys who can go coast to coast like Kobe could and lay up some Skrilla into your wallet as Rick Fox often would and would very rarely miss. You won't want to miss out on the deals at Alpha Draft, where you can play games like CSGO, League of Legends, Dota 2, Smite. Link in the description box below if you'd like to play Alpha Draft. Skrilla.